So we'll get Sarah on here. We'll share her screen. And then she'll go through. And I don't know what she's going to cover first. The herbicide updates.
Yep, I think that's the plan. Can you guys see what I think you can see?
Yep. And it looks great, Sarah.
Okay, awesome. Yep, we'll start with some herbicide updates, and then Jeannie had asked me to talk a little bit about sort of a systems approach to weed management. So I'll give kind of the 30,000-foot view of some of those topics, and then Jeremie's going to step in and give some of the more kind of Western Kansas oriented data for that, and then we'll go from there. So. All right, Miss Sandra, did you get your poll questions put in? Did I give you time to do that?
Zoom call right now. I'm on a Zoom call on Herbicides.
I can't hear you, Sandra.
What?
Sandra, you're muted.
There you
There
go.
you go.
Now can you hear me?
Now I got you.
Sorry.
Did you get these put in as poll questions or?
I did not get your
Oh.
poll questions. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, that's okay.
So if they just want to answer in the chat, that's fine.
Well, I mean, I think with just a couple folks, I think we're just gonna
Okay.
roll. So
Okay.
all right. So the first product up this afternoon, guys, is Iron Gate. This is a product for wheat, effective on mustards and some winter annual grasses. Some things to consider with this one would be to think about, some of the specifics regarding the adjuvant selection there. And also it can be applied fall or spring. So think about the fact that those fall applied applications tend to provide better weed control and do a better job of preserving crop yield. The second product up on the list here is Inversa. I kind of like to think of Inversa as Corteva's answer to Bayer's Warrant product. It's an encapsulated acetochlor. So the encapsulation, the kind of secret sauce, is a different type of encapsulation. But my crew has looked at this product in the field for a couple of years now, and we feel like they're pretty similar in terms of weed control and crop response. I did not put those data slides in really for the sake of time today. Next product up, Resicor Rev. Some of you may be familiar with Resicor XL from last year. After they put that product in the marketplace, they figured out that there were some handling issues there. So they went back to the drawing board a little bit with the formulation, and in the market this year for 2025, we have Resicor Rev. Same rates, same application restrictions as Resicor XL. Just the other thing to think about here, the key difference between Resicor XL and Resicor Rev and the original Resicor is encapsulation. This next product is probably the most interesting of the new products we got to add to the weed guide this year. This product is called Certain. It is a combination of Zidua, so the active ingredient there is pyroxasulfone, so Zidua, plus an encapsulated form of saflufenicil. Saflufenicil is the active ingredient in Sharpen. So that's the really novel piece there, is that encapsulation of the Sharpen molecule. That does a couple of things for us. First, it lets us apply this product post-emergence to corn. You can see they're up to V3. The second thing it does is kind of a negative, and that is that it takes away the burn down activity of the Sharpen. One of the warnings on there, you can see it talks about early post applications resulting in spotting on the emerged leaves. That is accurate. We saw that pretty consistently in our plots at Ashland Bottoms near Manhattan. But the corn grows out of it right away. I actually was visiting with a retailer earlier this winter, and he said, "What do you mean? I never saw any crop injury with Certain." But he was there several weeks after the application was made. So the corn had outgrown the spotting before he got to see the plots. This is some weed control data from a list of treatments that BASF did ask us to put out. So you can see their objective here was to compare about 3 rates of Certane with and without atrazine to some of the other competing products on the marketplace. I think the takeaway here is that across the board, we had 95+% weed control. And with the exception of Trivolt, everything was statistically similar to 99% weed control. Next product up is Zalo. The folks at AMVAC get kind of excited about Zalo because from a formulation chemistry perspective, it's kind of a trick to get quizalofop and glufosinate to play together. But what Zalo is it's a premix of Assure and Liberty. So we've only seen it in a couple of plots for soybeans. Looks like Assure plus Liberty. Nothing terribly exciting there. One thing to think about, if you are planning on the Assure to control volunteer corn, it's important to make sure that your volunteer corn is not enlist corn. There's not a ton of enlist corn on the marketplace right this moment, but I think we're going to start seeing more and more of those hybrids out and about. So just be aware that enlist corn is resistant or tolerant of quizalofop, so tolerant of Assure. So Zalo and Assure types of products are not going to control enlist corn. The last of the new products that we need to talk about here is Liberty Ultra. So if you all are familiar with the difference between metolachlor, so those are original dual formulations, and S-metolachlor, the newer dual formulations, you'll understand the difference between Liberty 280 and Liberty Ultra. What's going on here is that we know that the herbicide form, the active form of the glufosinate molecule, is the glufosinate P instead of the alternative form. So they kind of work like right-handed and left-handed gloves. And in this case, only one of the gloves actually fits the target site in the weeds. And so this is just a purified version of glufosinate. So it contains a greater concentration of the active form. And so what that does for us is it lets us use lower rates. So you see there the kind of recommended rate for this product is going to be 29 ounces per acre. One of the other things about this product is that it is compliant with the EPA's herbicide strategy. So we've been sort of trying to look ahead at what was going to happen to our herbicide labels once the EPA started to be compliant with the court order to honor the Endangered Species Act. And so now this is the first example we've seen of a herbicide that is compliant with the herbicide strategy. So a couple of things here. In order to be compliant with the herbicide strategy, the main changes we're going to see on the labels are intended to do 2 things, reduce drift and reduce runoff. So Liberty is a pretty environmentally safe herbicide. So these mitigations or these additional restrictions are going to be, I think, pretty easy for most folks to meet. Some key things to point out here is that on this label, they have a minimum and a maximum wind speed very specifically designated. So it needs to be between 3 and 15 miles per hour. Somewhat similar to what we've seen with the Enlist and the XtendiMax labels, there is a downwind spray buffer requirement. In this case, it's just 10 feet. You can also reduce that spray buffer distance to 0 if you use a DRA. And also something else to think about there is much like the Enlist and Extend labels, the same types of managed areas count as buffer distance. So things like roads, road ditches, farmsteads, things of that nature. So that's the drift component for Liberty Ultra. The runoff component is that you have to attain 3 runoff mitigation points. And honestly, to go through all of that is almost a whole nother presentation. But basically, you need to do things like make sure you have soil conservation practices, or you know what soil conservation practices are in place in the field, documenting different things, making sure that you've worked with a crop consultant or extensions agent who understands soil conservation. So someone like Sandra or Luke, things of that nature. So 3 is going to be pretty easy for folks to attain. But as we start looking at products like atrazine, there will be places where atrazine requires 6 runoff mitigation points. So the maximum possible for any herbicide is 9. So even atrazine, which is, historically been watched very carefully in terms of, water quality concerns, it only has 6. The way you figure out how many points you need is complicated. The proposed label has a county by county listing of the range of points required for each county. And then within the county, you have to know which watershed you're in. And then the watersheds are broken down into those that have a history of higher concentrations of atrazine and lower concentrations of atrazine. So your number for any particular field could be between 3 and 6.
Say,
So
Sarah, I
yeah,
had a question on the prior slide. Would you prefer I
Yeah.
wait until you're through?
Nope.
Or
no, let's do it.
okay, on wind speed, I see the word measured. Does that mean that one can't use a phone app, for speed, that you actually have to measure wind speed?
They want you to have an anemometer, a wind speed measurer in field and collecting that in field. Some of the newer sprayers, I think, have some onboard weather stations, and that could count, but they want it on location. So specifically from that site, at boom height. And they actually talk about wanting to have weather data every 15 minutes in the field, which I think that's a stretch. But they do want it measured in the field because
Okay, so one would need to keep
I-
one would need to keep a record of that then as well, I take it.
yes, you would want to make sure that you've got that written down or documented somewhere. Whether that's just on your phone, like you could write it down on your phone. You could just keep your pocket notebook, whatever. But yeah, you're going to want to have that documented.
Okay, thanks.
So I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I know that
No,
I know
that
that
is
nobody
what it
likes to
is, so, yeah.
likes to slow down anymore when they're spraying, but yeah. So on those weather apps, though, we were part of a multi-state group that looked at just the variability in those weather apps, like on the phone compared to the Mesonet weather stations at a given location. So I sent an undergrad out with all the different apps on the smartphone, and she stood at the Mesonet. And the variability in those data points was all over the board. And so I think that's a lot of why they want this data on site. So, all right, atrazine. The thing I want to point out here is that this is just a proposed label. So the comment period just recently closed. We don't anticipate new markets or new labels to hit the market until 2027. So not this summer, not next summer, but the following summer. So we've got some time to adjust here. There has been much back and forth between, for example, the Corn Growers Association and the EPA trying to make these mitigations workable. So I don't expect we'll see a ton of change from here forward because there's been a lot of back and forth just to get to this point. Okay, so short and sweet. Towards late summer, early fall, this was kind of the probably a multi-billion-dollar question for Bayer, but also $1 million question for farmers. We are not going to see over-the-top dicamba labels this summer. The folks that I have talked to are basically planning to manage extend soybeans like Liberty Link soybeans. Similar story for extend cotton. Obviously, we have some concerns about that and the pressures that we're putting on Liberty in terms of herbicide resistance. So just need to be thinking about making sure you have a solid residual program and cultural practices that are going to suppress weeds and keep them from germinating. And then, we do have products like Reflex or products that contain fomesafen. They may not be super effective, but if we're applying them in a timely manner to smaller weeds, hopefully we can stay ahead of things. Okay, that's the weed guide updates. So now let's talk about a systems approach to weed management. We'll try to get through this in about 15 or 20 minutes here, and then turn the floor over to Jeremie or Sandra. All right. So just an overview kind of what a herbicide application timeline should look like in a wheat-based cropping system. Things to point out here would just be the fact that at each of these application timings, we kind of have a different focus and a different priority. So if you're in kochia country, that early spring or even the fall application is going to be focused on kochia. That at planting or that application closest to planting is going to probably be focused on pigweeds, mostly Palmer amaranth in the state of Kansas. And I've already talked about this once, but just being timely with post-emergence applications. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of some novel concepts of what that means here as we go through the afternoon. And then the one I want to point out as far as specifically wheat is just to be sure we're staying on top of those applications in wheat stubble. I know that right after wheat harvest, it seems like we get the rain after the wheat crop is out or while we're trying to get the wheat crop out. And that definitely makes those post-harvest applications a challenge in wheat production systems, but they're so, so important for not making that weed seed bank any bigger. So this slide here, I summarized the herbicide resistance cases, the cases of multiple herbicide resistance for Palmer amaranth and kochia. I think Jeremie's probably going to show you some data looking just at overall cases, but I wanted to focus in on the multiple resistance. So that means that it's one population that is resistant to more than one herbicide. Okay, so the solid lines represent the Palmer amaranth data. The dashed or the dotted lines represent the kochia data. So you can see we have getting close to 20 populations that are resistant to 2 different herbicide modes of action. But I really want to draw your attention to this dark purple solid line that shows up here in 2021. That is a 6-way resistant population that was confirmed out of Kansas. And so I've talked about this a few times on the extension circuits. The thing that makes this population particularly troublesome is that 5 of those 6 herbicide modes of action were the result of metabolic resistance. So basically that means that enzymes in the plant are acting too fast to break down the herbicide. And because the herbicide is being broken down so quickly, it doesn't have time to effectively kill the plant. Metabolic resistance is harder to identify because it takes a longer time to develop. It's more of a gradual increase in tolerance than that kind of very distinct, living plant, dead plant situation that we see with target site resistance, which would be what most of the cases of glyphosate resistance that we see are. But you can see even glyphosate is susceptible to metabolic resistance. So why is this important? From a management perspective, the biggest reason that this is important is that when we increase the activity of those enzymes, it means that we have the potential to break down, especially with the one of the 2 classes of enzymes. They're just looking for a particular building block in those herbicide molecules. And so any herbicide molecule that has that building block can be degraded too fast. And so it gives resistance. One genetic change gives resistance to even herbicides that plant has never been exposed to. There's a research paper in the peer-reviewed literature. They found a 2,4-D resistant population that's also resistant to a brand new molecule that was never even in the marketplace yet. So this has major implications for how we think about managing herbicide resistance. One big thing it does is that it reduces the effectiveness of mixing and rotating herbicides. And that has been, kind of our favorite mitigation response to herbicide resistance is to mix and rotate effective modes of action. But that becomes a less useful tool when we start talking about metabolic resistance. And I just wanted to put this slide in here to let folks kind of get a visual for the fact that this is a big part of our problem, in the sense that we have not had any new herbicide modes of action introduced to the agronomic crop market in the US since the mid-90s. We've got a couple of them. This group 28 molecule is probably going to be introduced to the rice markets shortly. I mean, I would assume that they'll be coming forward with some others as well. Okay, so what needs to be our response to metabolic herbicide resistance? Really, the answer is that we need to have zero weed seed production, right? Zero weed seed production. Now, I recognize that from a very pragmatic boots on the ground sense, this is at the minimum, a big stretch, right? We're asking for perfection, and I've not yet met a perfect human. But what I would tell you is that we need to be heading that direction and kind of aiming for that zero weed seed production as the very best we can, okay? As the very best we can. So what does that look like? We have to have strong residual programs. In my next slide set that I'll talk about towards the end of the afternoon, I'll talk a little bit more about what a strong residual program looks like. We need to think about timely post-emergence applications, and that's what we'll talk about next. And then I'm briefly going to hit on some alternative tactics. I know Jeremie's going to talk about some of them as well. I think the caveat with some of the non-chemical management strategies, aside from this idea of strategic tillage, is that in a lot of ways, they still seem very far-fetched. They're not as effective as herbicides at this stage in the game. And they have, other just practical limitations still at this point. But I want to keep putting these ideas in front of you guys so that you can start thinking creatively of how are we going to take the selection pressure off of the herbicides. All right, timing post applications. If you are still thinking about making your post-emergence applications when that entire flush of weeds has had a chance to germinate and emerge, you're probably not going to get good weed control, right? This is one of the negative, long-lasting side effects of the Roundup Ready era, is that we want to have one post-emergence pass and be done. But these data, they were collected from multiple Palmer amaranth populations by a researcher at Purdue University. And what they found, that green dashed line represents the percentage. So if you get all the way to 1, that's 100% of the Palmer amaranth population that is basically too big to kill, late vegetative stage, okay? They didn't document leaf numbers or heights. They just called it late vegetative stage. So if you wait until you get 90% of that population at that late vegetative stage, you're not going to get good control of those weeds that emerged later because they're going to be buried in the canopy in all likelihood. In addition, you're probably not going to get great control of those big weeds. And so the recommendation then would be to think about targeting your herbicide applications when we get to 30% emergence. And so we can use growing degree day calculations, so heat unit accumulation, to estimate when we might get to that 30% emergence point. And it's somewhere between, like right around 200 growing degree days is the target from the time we know we have weed seeds that are in conditions that they can germinate until we see 30% emergence of that population. So I recognize the expenses that are associated with making multiple post-emergence passes. But what I would tell you is that I think this is one place for some of the in-crop weed detection or targeted herbicide application systems. So the one on the market that's getting the most chatter right now is John Deere See and Spray. If we can use maybe the same amount of herbicide, just split over 2 applications, that does minimize some of that extra cost that we would incur if we were making 2 broadcast applications. I did some interviews with farmers that are using the system, and a couple of them actually indicated that that is one of the things they see as a benefit to the system. And really, from a weed management perspective, I think that is going to make us better weed managers if we adopt that philosophy. The other thing I'd like to talk about today in terms of application timeliness is this idea of making your applications according to the delta T. So in science, delta indicates change. A lot of times it's the Greek letter delta, so it looks like a triangle. But what we're talking about here is the change or the difference in the wet bulb reading on a thermometer or on a weather station and the dry bulb reading on the weather station. It's related to temperature and humidity, but it's not directly related. It's not exactly the same. So the ideal, well, okay, so back up. This system was really developed by the Australians. Some of our colleagues and counterparts in the Northern Plains have borrowed the concept from the Australians and are starting to use that, some of their custom applicators and farmers. And so the small graph on the left just shows calculations of delta T in degrees Celsius. But my partner in crime at North Dakota State University did the math and converted it to degrees Fahrenheit in the big graph on the right. So I owe Joe thanks for saving me time on the math here. So the idea of delta T is that we want to make our herbicide applications in this green area on that chart. So that's delta T values basically between 4 and 14. Okay, so you can see that's corresponding to temperatures somewhere around like 97, 98 here on this far side. I'm sorry, I cannot. That relative humidity between 97 and 98%. And then those temperatures went all the way up to 104. Okay. Now, as we got down to lower temperatures, then it was 80% relative humidity. Okay. So we're measuring how fast it takes a droplet to evaporate here. So 4 to 14. They have these kind of orange and yellow areas where they say, you might see some reduction in control, but it's probably still going to be, agronomically acceptable. And then there's this red zone down here. Okay. If you've got like 38% humidity and it's 104, you should not spray, right? Because 2 of the questions I get in and out every summer, one is how hot and humid is hot and humid enough for glufosinate to work, for Liberty to work? Okay. So the answer here is in the green zone for delta T. And then the other question that I get every time we get that first heat wave in the summer is, when do I need to think about parking my sprayer? And so the answer there would be when we get that delta T that's in that red range, so greater than about 22. Right now, I don't have a good calculator tool for you guys to just plug these numbers in and get to it. We're still really in the phase of, just validating this for Kansas. If we get to a point where we feel like it's going to be good for Kansas, we can enter into conversations with our friends over at the Mesonet and see about, much like they have the cattle comfort index and the inversion, temperature inversion data, we could probably get this delta T data really easily onto the Mesonet. So we're trying to validate that. We've got 1 year, 1 location, 4 replications, 5 different dates. So we picked a week where we knew there was a front coming through, and we made applications. Mostly they were between like 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. So right around midday. But we were targeting days and times with different temperatures and different relative humidities. And so the grad students did a great job with this project. When they got back into the office, they converted and they found the delta T's or the times of all these applications. And so the takeaway here, with the exception of this outlier down here with the delta T of 4, that Liberty Plus Enlist application, all of our applications that were less than, say, 80% occurred in that red zone of delta T. So this is still the Celsius scale here for delta T. So, and they were all in that red zone though. So what this is telling me is that I think this is worth looking at and collecting data to give you guys confidence in using this system and then going forward from there. I just want to touch briefly on
Aaron, did you
non-chemical
see that chat?
Yes.
That question in the
Oh,
chat.
no, I cannot see the chat right now, Sandra.
Oh, well, I'll read it. I'll read it to you.
Okay.
He heard that there's a good website for getting localized growing degree date information. Can you talk a little about that real quick?
You can, I believe you can access growing degree day information from the Mesonet website. And I think maybe the best way to approach this question and get a satisfactory answer is that while you and Jeremy are talking, I will look up the webpage and drop it in the chat. Will that work?
Yep, that'd be great.
Okay, perfect. All right, next up, non-chemical weed control. Don't want to spend a ton of time on this. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning and kind of keeping in front of folks is that one of the most highly underutilized weed management tools we have is sanitation and prevention. This is just a picture of the mower we use to try to keep our alleys under control in the summer. And you can see that the tech didn't get it cleaned up. And so I ended up with pigweeds growing in my mower, which is a great look for a weed management program. But I know it takes time, but other than the time, it generally doesn't cost much else, just to use caution and to try to keep equipment clean, to do things like harvest your cleanest fields first and your weediest fields last, things of that nature. So I think that's something that needs to become more and more important. New techniques that we've been talking about. One would be harvest weed seed control, specifically the impact mills. The data that are shown on this slide come out of Australia, and they were looking at a ryegrass species. Okay, so I think the first point to make on this is that these systems are intended to complement herbicides. They're not herbicide replacements in our large-scale ag systems. And it takes time to use a tool like this to drive down that weed seed bank. If you figure a pigweed is going to last, let's say on average, about 3 years in the soil seed bank, assuming you have zero weed seed production, it's going to take at least 3 years, right, to really get that weed seed bank depleted of pigweed seed. So it takes time. The other thing to think about on these, though, is that the effectiveness is highly dependent on the weed biology. So Jeremie's going to show you some data looking at the likelihood of pigweeds to retain their seed at the time of milo harvest. You know, so if we think about the fact that in your all's part of the world, I would venture that the #1 weed problem is palmer amaranth in milo or grain sorghum. And so Jeremie's going to show you some data looking at pigweed seed retention at the time of milo harvest. So that's a big thing. The other things, you know, would be just the height of that weed seed head. And then how prone is that seed to shattering like at the header, right? So this is some research that I was involved in. It was a multi-state project, and we were looking at pigweeds at the time of soybean harvest. And so that we were using platform headers to harvest those pigweeds. Okay, we found that we were losing 20 to 40% of those pigweeds at the header, and roughly 50 to 80% were making it to the impact mill. Okay, not going to steal Jeremie's thunder about how well the mill works, but I will say, Jeremie, during the presentation at Nest City last week, I got out my calculator and I was like, okay, so I think based on the round numbers that I have and that you have, I think we can get about 2/3 of the pigweed seeds that are produced in the field eliminated with an impact mill. So not perfect. Again, it's a complement to herbicides and other tactics, but I think it could definitely be something that could help us move the needle in terms of herbicide resistance management. We've looked at a couple different iterations of inter-row mowing. These are rescue scenarios. You guys know the weeds are going to grow back. I'm not in love with these systems as a plan A for weed management. Dave Button out of Great Bend is developing the row shaver, and he's a world-class human being, and I think he's got a product that has a good fit for some of these rescue situations or situations that are otherwise limited for herbicide use. But herbicides are still going to be more effective. In addition, herbicides are still going to be more effective than electrocution. That's something that we've looked at as part of a multi-state study. Our plots were down around Great Bend. Overall, we had less than 50% control of Palmer amaranth, about a 30% reduction in the viable seeds that were produced. Honestly, the rescue herbicide treatment provided greater control than the electrocution did in this particular study. Lasers are getting some attention, especially in the specialty crop world. Price points just aren't there to make them economically viable for commodity crops. And then the last one is directed energy. There's a company that has a tool that emits certain wavelengths of light that can actually prevent weed seed production. So they've collected some data looking to try to use this as a harvest weed seed control tactic, where they would try to irradiate the seeds in the combine. Yes, combine fires are a thing. They're not to that point of figuring out all of those kind of pragmatic and engineering pieces yet. But the reason I'm interested in looking at it is, if we use this as a like an in-season tool, an in-season pass to take some pressure off of the residual herbicides. It's got potential. Whether it can get there or not, we're still finding out what the limitations are, but it could be something interesting. So takeaways here today, we got to be aiming for zero tolerance in terms of weed seed production, especially when we consider metabolic herbicide resistance. I think it's important that we consider the environment in addition to weed size and things of that nature when we're planning herbicide applications. And then just, keeping those non-chemical tactics kind of in your mind, and figuring out when is the point at which you want to start trying them in your operation. Because that threshold is going to be different for everybody. But I think our friends in Australia would tell us that we don't want to wait until we have no other choices before we start to look at some of these and incorporate some of these options. So on that note, I would just remind you that to do the same thing and expect different results is a form of insanity. And so just, recognize that there's not going to be a silver bullet coming forward. You might have noticed some of the slides that I used today had a little red square at the bottom of them that said War Against Weeds. That little icon was supposed to help me remember to tell you guys that we had an episode or two on that topic on the War Against Weeds podcast. I think it was last spring. Last fall, last spring, I was asking all of the guests at the end of their interview, do you think there's a silver bullet for weed control? It was kind of interesting to see all the ways that folks could say, not a chance. Okay, so we've got to be thinking differently about things. Contact information, you guys will see this again today. Sandra always knows how to get a hold of me. Social media handles. This is the name of the podcast. If you just Google War Against Weeds, you'll find it. And then just a reminder to encourage folks to sign up for the Agronomy E update. Sandra can probably help you do that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing, Sandra.
Okay, any questions for Sarah? We'll give you a couple minutes here, maybe while I get my slides up.
I'll look up that website about calculating heat units too.
Okay, that would be great. Okay, is that the correct one up, Sarah? Nope.
It is, but it's the right side set, but it is your presenter mode. It's not the presentation
Okay.
mode.
How about that?
Now you got it.
Okay, okay. Any more questions for Sarah? And I can't see the chat either, Sarah, so if you see any chat things while I'm talking, just go on and do that.
Will do.
Okay, okay. Again, my name is Sandra Wick, and I'm only going to take about maybe 15 minutes here. We're going to kind of shift gears just a little bit. And I know that you guys have all seen this. Just a second, I'm going to change this so I can see here. I know all of you have seen the 2025 Chemical Weed Book. It's hot off the press. It was a little bit late in getting to the, let me try to get that thing here. There it is. It was a little bit late getting off the press, but most of the extension offices should have your booklet now. We are very fortunate that our K-State weed specialist leadership team puts this together every year. Nebraska has one too. So we all share each other's too. So, and they all have some strengths and weaknesses, but I would encourage you to stop by and get this book at their extension offices. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through this really quickly. And if you happen to have your book handy, I'm going to go through kind of the different things that are available for you in the resources. I haven't done this yet, but it's a good thing if you take the time and put some tabs in here so you can easily find things very quickly. Since it has the index in there, and then you can find things a lot easier. But as you can see, it not only controls field crops, but it also includes pastures, rangeland, and non-crop land as well. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Here is where you can find some things very easily. It has a control find feature in this. Okay, I'm going to, there you go. So what you can see is you hit the find button up there, you just hit control find on your computer, type in what you want to find, and this particular example shows you dicamba, and as you can see, it's going to go through the whole book, and it's going to find the dicamba information for you. So that's just kind of a quick, easy way to kind of find that information for you, pretty handily and pretty readily for you. Okay. Okay. Here's kind of everything that it covers. So as I mentioned, it covers crops, pasture, and other non-crop land. And you can see the context there on the side. So like I said, we're very fortunate that we have such an extensive book printed up for you, especially every year. So keep this handy as you can in every pickup, in every tractor, in your shop, so you can have it pretty handy for you, available. So you have any questions, you can easily go to that. Okay, so if you have this in front of you, this is on page 11 in your book. And the first thing we're going to go to, and this is probably one of the most common things that I point out to producers, because they want to know, well, exactly how long is the chemical going to persist in the soil? And yes, we do have that information in here, and that is on page 11. It goes through a lot of different common name chemicals there on your left, and it gives you the trade names as well. And then it gives you the LD or the toxicity in that. And then it also gives you how long it would persist in the soil. So here's kind of one of them that it talks about, and see how it goes from 8 to 12 weeks up at the top, clear down to non-persistent, and clear down where it says 2 months. Other one says 2 to 3 months. Other one says 4 to 6 weeks. So there is a lot of variability in this. So it's really important that you keep the book handy so you know kind of where you're at on some of those herbicides, because Sarah talked a lot about different herbicides that are out there and available. And so it's very important that you look at those rotation intervals that's recommended in this guide for you. Okay, so here's one that we talked about on dicamba. So as you can see, there's all the different trade names. It says mildly irritating. So if you get it in contact with your skin, and then it can persist anywhere from 3 to 12 weeks, just depending on a lot of different soil factors like moisture, the different types of soil, temperature, that type of thing on the persistence, how long it can stay in the soil. Alrighty, moving on, and this would be in pages 14 and 15. They have spent a lot of time on coming up with some approximate retail costs for you. And so what this could give you, and here's the different columns there. This is approximate cost on cash basis. So you may have some other things that you work for at your particular retailers, like you might get a discount if you order by a certain date, but this kind of gives you some approximate cost. And like I said, they update this every year, not only herbicides, but harvest aids and some other things that you can use as well. Alrighty, moving on pages 18, I believe, to 22 in your, no, 17 to 21 in your book. It gives you lots and lots of herbicide premixes. So this is a really, really handy guide to keep pretty handy for you. So as you can see there in the green box to your left over there, let's take a look at authority. So, you know, Sarah mentions authority a lot, but there's lots of different formats of authority or formulations. It looks like there's 8 different ones. And so it gives you the exact premixes in those. So it gives you an idea how many pounds of one product, like this has Spartan, and that one has, the top one has Pursuit. So it tells you lots of the different ingredients in that product. Okay, so as you can see here, and here's a closer up picture of that. And here's the difference between Lexar and Lumex. As you can see there, it has the same chemicals in it, but it's different formulations. For example, the Lexar has 1.7 pounds of metolachlorophor, or the dual 2 magnum, whereas Lumex almost has 2.5 pounds. So there's differences, but it has the same chemical. So that's important to know that as well. Alrighty. So as I said, it covers many, many different crops. As you can see, it lists there. So what I like to do is take my book and just tab it out. So it's pretty easy to find corn, find wheat, find alfalfa. And it's so you can find that pretty readily. But as you can see, it covers a lot of different things besides crops. It also covers CRP. It can cover some rangeland weeds, and especially your brush and trees control and management on rangeland. All right, so let's take a look at this just a little bit more specifically. And I know that this book has been around for a while, but maybe you really haven't sat down and looked to see exactly where things are in this book to help you out. So here's specifically our example on corn, and it shows you the different responses to weeds. And so you can see this one particular, and we kind of talked about the Lumex and the Lexar, but it tells you different responses to different crops. So this is especially important and very helpful that you have it right in one spot that you can compare and look at all the different herbicides. So it's comparing the long spine sandburr to the pigweed when it comes to Lumex and XR. Okay, Lumex, EZ, or Lexar. Okay, so it looks like for pigweed, it's excellent right here, but for the sandbar, it's only fair to good. So there are some chemicals that you can use that do a good job on different crops, but then there's others that are more specific and do a better job on certain different families of weeds rather than the other families. Okay, So here's another example, and I really like this section that this book offers, is it really gives you some very specific comments or limitations in some paragraphs there for you. So this particular one is the Accurine. And so it actually tells you you can apply that from 28 days before planting through early post-emergence to your field, silage, and seed corn prior to corn attaining 12 inches tall. So it's very, very specific information to provide you to help you try to decide on which chemical and when to apply that. And then another important aspect of this is it gives you the rotation intervals. So 4 months for wheat, rye, or barley, 10 months for cotton, soybeans, and sorghum, and even 18 months for canola and alfalfa. So you can really use this section here to really plan your crop rotation and the chemicals to use and when to use them. Alrighty, so here's some other herbicides and harvest aids, that we went through. So there's a different pages for you. And also herbicides for fallow. So I can't see that, but I don't know of very many farmers that use summer fallow. It's becoming maybe a little bit more, but not very many people that have fallow ground anymore. But it does, and I think that this is a new section this year. Is that correct, Sarah? And she may not be on, but I think this is a new section this year in this book. So if that involves you, you may want to take a look at that section here in the book for you.
Hey, Sandra,
Yes.
that
Okay.
is a new section for this year. And I think, one thing to think about is that this book hits the whole state. And so, a lot of that is really for Pat's benefit, honestly, down in Garden City. So,
Okay. So it's primarily focused on winter wheat. But they felt it was a very important section to include in there. So if that includes you, please take note of that. And it's got some very good, extra notes there for you with very specific information on those particular chemicals. And there's just kind of going through that. And you notice down here it says Fallow Master BS. And the BS actually, am I going to remember what that stands for? And broad spectrum. So as you can see, it's a very good broad spectrum herbicide to use. Okay. As we mentioned earlier, it also lists herbicides for many other parts of the management of your farming enterprise. So a big one that I get a lot of questions on is brush and tree control on your rangeland. So, and then the rangeland weeds too, and noxious weeds. So it is a very good resource for you in order to get the most up-to-date information since it is printed and published every year. Okay, so here's how it goes through. And it lists in some of the weeds, specific weeds that specific chemicals will target. This particular one is targeting broomweed, cuckleburr, common ragweed, sunflowers, and thistles. So, and it talks about specific chemicals in order that you would use. Let's just put, for example, Cimarron Plus, apply when weeds are less than 4 inches taller or diameter. And it seriously does mean less than 4 inches tall in order to do a pretty good job on it. So do not apply more than 0.625 ounces per acre to buffalo grass. So it just gives you some specific things that may be hard to pick out if you look at the full label. So these are the important points that they wanted you to remember when you are using Cimarron Plus. And it gives you the formulated product per acre, and it also gives you the active ingredient needed per acre. Okay. Also, it gives you a place for the noxious weeds. And I get lots of questions on musk thistle. as well as the Canada thistle. So, and it also lists different options for the Canada thistle in specific crops. So as you can see here, just for example, the Canada thistle in corn, the herbicide recommendation is Stinger and non-cropland, Tordon 22K, rangeland, it gives you milestone and plus some others. So it's very specific information for you in order to use to help you out. Okay, so as you can see, this particular book can become very handy for you to use. So keep it handy, like I said, in a combine, in pickups, in tractors, wherever, so you can have it right there. And just remember, the label is a law. And you probably have heard that little saying before, but if the herbicide guide isn't detailed enough, you can look it up on the label. And there's a different sites there in order you can find it, greenbook.net and cdms.net. But I will tell you, and Sarah can maybe attest to it too, some of those labels could be like 15, 20, 25 pages long. And sometimes it's really hard to find maybe the specific information that you are needing. So this book can help you with that in highlighting the important points in order to remember. So as I mentioned, take as many copies as you need. Go to any extension office, should have a copy of the bound book for you, or you can download it as a PDF and use that Control F to easily find specific herbicides or things that you find or that you're looking for quickly. And if you would like to, I'm going to put this up later, Sarah, in the chat, and I'm going to go on and stop sharing mine in order for Jeremie to have it up. But we would like you to evaluate this if you can. You know, Extension always is asking for evaluations and your input on how we put meetings together. So I will put this up in the chat. It's not going to be that long. It's very short answers. So I will kind of put this up in the chat randomly. And then you can do that at your own convenience. Okay. So is Jeremie up next, or are you on again, Miss Sarah?
Jeremie's up next. So only comments in the chat were Luke plugging the CatCon in Clay Center on March 7th. So
Okay. So Luke, while he's getting his slides up, do you want to tell him a little bit more information about that? And you're welcome to come on here.
Sure. I won't show my lovely face because I'm driving right now.
Oh, no.
I'll just mention, so some of you guys might know about CARTA, the Kansas Ag Research and Technology Association, basically just a grassroots organization of farmers who like to do their own research on things, incorporating different research methods and technologies in trials on their own farms. We are collaborating with them, CARTA and K-State Research and Extension, in our extension district just next door to you guys in River Valley, to have their annual conference at Clay Center this year. It's going to be a jam-packed day full of presentations from extension specialists like Sarah and some of our others that Sandra's had at extension meetings in the past. And we're also going to be bringing in some farmer researchers and some industry folks as well, with a keynote presentation from Dr. Westlow from Mississippi State, basically adapting John Deere's see and spray technology into a see and till precision weed management cultivator. So all the information is on that flyer I put in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or me an email or something like that. But we'd love to get you guys involved and registered if that's something that you guys are interested in. So thanks, Sandra.
Okay, great, Luke. And that has been in my electronic newsletter that we send out weekly every Friday. So if you have any questions, just go on there and register online, and let Luke or I know if you have any questions. Okay, Jeremie, are you getting your computer shared with your screen and your slides?
All right.
There we go.
Can you see it, Sandra?
Yep, I can see it great.
Perfect. Sounds great. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for this opportunity this afternoon to be part of this event, and thank you to Sandra for working so hard to put these events together. Again, my name is Jeremie Kouame. I joined K-State about a year ago. I came to originally from Ivory Coast, which is my country. And I came to the US some years ago with a Fulbright program for a master's degree at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And then I got my PhD at the University of Arkansas, working on pigweed resistance to some group 15 herbicides. About this event, Ginny told me to talk about strategic tillage as a tool for weed management. A lot of research has been done in Western Kansas using strategic tillage. And so both researchers who are soil scientists and other disciplines investigated a lot of aspects related to soil health, but I'm just gonna present the data which is on weed control. So again, we know how important no-till farming is for our dryland cropping systems here in Western Kansas because it allows us to store more soil moisture. At the same time, it allows crop intensification with the increase of crop residue on soil surface. And a lot of soil health benefits have been attached to the no-till farming, including reduction in erosion from water and wind, as well as improvement of soil structure. But to control weeds in these types of cropping systems, we have to rely on herbicides a lot. And we know, for example, with heavy use of glyphosate, that resistance became an issue. And in addition to resistance to herbicides, we also have some perennial grasses that get established and gets really hard to control. We can see two photos here. The top one, which was a plot that received a strategic tillage operation, and we see less weed infestations. In contrast, the photo on the bottom was just no-till. These were no-till plots, and we see some weed infestations there, a lot of grasses. So that's when strategic tillage comes in to help. Again, as Sarah said, we want to use as many methods as possible in order to remove some of the pressure we put on those herbicides. So our goal is to keep those herbicides as effective for the longest time. And in order to do that, we want to combine multiple strategies. Again, each of them will be like a tool within the toolbox of integrated weed management, and we cannot rely on one of them. They all need to go together in a kind of like a systems approach, as Sarah talked about, or also put in another way as an integrated weed management program. And so basically what happened with this study, it's the researchers had a long-term no-till experiment going on at the Ag Research Center in Hayes, which was established in 1975. And so in 2016, what they did was to split this field in two parts. The first part was kept under no-till conditions, but the other part, they just came up with a one-time strategic tillage operation. And so what they called strategic tillage was a sweep plow equipped with pickers that they did when the soil erosion risk was the lowest, right? And they had a first tillage operation up to 3-inch depth. And 3 days later, they came back with another operation at 6-inch depth. And then they left the field, go back to no-till. And the weeds they had issues with at this site were perennial grasses such as tumble windmill grass, purple freeawn, as well as herbicide-resistant kochia populations. After this tillage operation, they came about 1 month later to do some evaluation of weed control. So they did some countings of weed densities of those weeds I mentioned earlier. And based on their counting data, they reported this result. Again, the experiment had, let's say, 3 crop rotation scenarios. They had winter wheat fallow rotation scenario, winter wheat sorghum fallow, and then the continuous wheat scenario. And what they found in all the cases, in all scenarios, they found that the strategic tillage operation significantly reduced the density of those weeds that were problematic, meaning purple freehound, tumble windmill grass, kochia. They had a very good reduction in the density of these weeds. Another finding was for the wheat yield, they found like the strategic tillage, the yield under strategic tillage was higher than the one in the no-till plot, with an average about 30 bushels per acre. Another thing with the sorghum grain yield, they found like the yield was similar between the strategic tillage plot and the no-till plot, with the strategic till plots averaging about 63 bushels per acre of yield. 6 years later, after this strategic tillage operation, a grad student of Dr. Obor went out to this field and did some weed counting again to see how the strategic tillage operated about 6 years previously would impact the diversity of weeds at this location. So what she found was across rotations, the no-till plots had a high population of tumble windmill grass, spotted spurge, and little barley. And she also found that the no-till treatment had about 58% greater weed diversity than the reduced till plots. But the strategic till plots were kind of like in the middle of the two. It was not different from the no-till, and it was not different from the reduced till plots. So, and this leads me to talk a little bit about other research that has been done on controlling those perennial grasses. We don't have a lot of data on tumble grass and on purple freehound. Most of the data we have is about windmill grass, and I'll be sharing some of this research, which was conducted here in Hayes in the early 2000s. And so, again, what we need to keep in mind is, even though these weeds become perennial, but they start as seedlings. So, because tumble windmill grass spreads by seed as well as stolons, and tumble grass and purple freehound also spread by seed. So, knowing the weakest point of weeds is gonna help us achieve a better control, because it's all about targeting this weakest point in order to control it. Because when the weeds becomes harder to control, we will expect a lot of failures when it comes to controlling those. But when we are timely and knowing what's the right time to hit this weed, we'll achieve a greater control. So that's the main point we should keep in mind. So this research that was conducted, again, in early 2000s, had a greenhouse aspect, a lab aspect, as well as a field aspect. And starting with the greenhouse aspect, so what the researchers wanted to understand was, first, how would increasing the rates of glyphosate impact the injury and mortality of windmill grass? And how would this impact itself be affected if the herbicide was applied when the plants were at the seedling stage, meaning the plants were between 2 and 4 inch tall. These are the lightest purple bars. And versus when the herbicide was applied, when the weed was at the tillering stage, which is the color within in the middle. And at that point, it's like each plant had between 5 and 10 tillers per plant. So, and what would happen if a herbicide was applied when the weed was at the heading stage, when the first seed head was emerging? And so the first thing they found applying glyphosate is like, of course, when they increased the rate of glyphosate from 0.5 pounds per acre to 0.75 and 1 pounds per acre, they realized with increasing the rates, they also achieved a greater injury, which makes complete sense, right? Increasing the rate of herbicide is going to lead to increased injury. The other thing they found was applying glyphosate on seedlings which were between 2 and 4 inch tall led to injury which was between 56 and 100% injury. Those bars, the lightest purple bars. But when they applied the herbicide at the tillering stage, when each plant had between 5 and 10 tillers, they achieved between 69 and 99% injury. And finally, when they applied glyphosate at the heading stage, when the first seed head was emerging, they realized that the injury was just between 28 and 61%. Another question they were interested in, though, was, okay, we know that group 1 herbicides that we call ACCase inhibiting herbicides, the FOPs and the DIMs, right? How would those herbicides compare to glyphosate? So they used 3 herbicides. We had 2 DIMs, we have Post and Select Max, and we had 1 FOP, which is Assure 2. And they applied those herbicides at the same stages. And what they found was, first of all, they realized that each of those 3 ACCase inhibiting herbicides applied achieved equal or greater injury than the highest rate of glyphosate. That was the first thing they realized. And the other thing they found is applying those 3 herbicides, grass-killing herbicides, to windmill grass at the seedling stage when the plants were between 2 and 4 inch tall, they achieved 100% mortality. But when they applied it at the tillering stage, when each plant was or had between 5 and 10 tillers, they achieved greater than 90% injury. But when they applied it at a later stage, at the heading stage, they found like injury was 83% and lower. Now, they were so curious to understand how would glyphosate move in the plants if it was applied at the seedling stage, and how would it move if it was applied at the tillering stage. So they used some C14 glyphosate, and 10 days after application, the first thing they realized was applying glyphosate at the tillering stage. This is the treated leaf. 10 days after application of glyphosate, they found 50% of the glyphosate applied remaining in the treated leaf. It means only 50% was translocated to the other organs of the plant, with only 9% in the other tillers. But when they applied it to the seedling stage, they realized that only 9% of the herbicide remained in the treated leaf 10 days after application, and up to 60% was translocated to the other tillers. So, which means when we apply glyphosate to seedlings, it has a greater chance of being translocated to the other parts of the weed, which is, of course, going to increase its effectiveness and the control level. Then they moved to the field to have a field experiment over a 2-year period in 2001 and 2. And so in a no-till corn system. So basically what they did was to have some pre-emergence herbicide programs as well as post-emergence herbicide programs. And the post-emergence herbicide programs were as follows. They had mesotrione plus atrazine. They had prime sulfuron plus prosulfuron plus atrazine, rimsulfuron plus nicosulfuron plus atrazine. And they had a post-application of glyphosate. And the last treatment was a sequential application of glyphosate followed by glyphosate. And these post-emergence herbicide programs were applied to windmill grass when it was between 1 and 2 inch tall. And the results, the findings were as follows. So
Yeah.
so all post treatments provided at least 90% control in both years, 6 weeks after application. And another aspect of the treatment was investigating the impact of residual herbicide or pre-emergence herbicide programs. And so they found also with the pre-emergence herbicide programs that they achieved 100% control at harvest, and except for one treatment where they had alachlor plus atrazine. And so again, these were herbicide programs implemented either before the weed emerges or when the weed was between 1 and 2 inch tall. So the lesson here would be the earlier the control, the better it is. And when we reach the heading stage, it's going to be really tough to control windmill grass. And this other research, which was done a few years ago, investigated multiple herbicide programs applied in a fallow scenario to windmill grass, which was at the heading stage again, and the author reported heights of between 10 and 12 inch tall tumble windmill grass. And what they found was these herbicide programs were ineffective because most of them provided less than 68%. Only glyphosate applied achieved about 85%. So again, the take-home message for this is once those perennial grasses get established as perennial stands, it's going to be really, really difficult to control. But if we are timely, if we are proactive in our approach to control those with pre-emergence herbicide programs to prevent new flushes, to prevent new germination or new emergence, we'll achieve a good control. And if we have some escapes that we are timely with our post-emergence programs applied to the weeds when they are less than 3 inch tall, will achieve a good control. And here I want to shift gears a little bit. Sarah already talked about the harvest with seed destructor. I just want to provide some data, preliminary data we got for some of the trials conducted here. And so again, when it comes to managing those weeds that are evolving resistance so rapidly, we want to include or integrate so many methods because we don't want the weed to get adapted to our cropping systems, and we don't want the weed to produce seeds that are going back to the soil seed bank. So the harvest weed seed control tactics allows us to target the seed which is on the weed at harvest, and then reduce the amount of the number of viable seeds returning to a soil seed bank. So this was a study conducted in 2023 for wheat seed retention. So at harvest, what happened was our research team here went to many soybean fields in central Kansas, as you can see here on this map. And they collected some samples from all these locations. And 12 counties were selected. And in each of these counties, they visited 1 or 2 soybean fields. And in each of these fields, they collected about 3 mature female palmer plants. They collected the biomass, collected the wheat seed, as well as collecting the wheat seed that would have been dropped before they reached the field. So they vacuumed the soil surrounding each plant they were collecting to make sure that they could get the seed that was lost by shattering. And so putting this data together and relating the seed production of the palmer female plants with their above ground biomass, we could make these predictions about a female palmer plant of about 0.4 pounds could produce about 85,000 seeds, right? We know that palmer is a prolific seed producer, which is the case we are seeing here. And every increase in the above ground biomass would provoke about 540 seed increase. Which is a lot. Again, because palmer is such a huge seed producer, we want to make sure we are not allowing the seed to return to a soil seed bank. If we have if we have some palmer plants which have escaped our weed control programs. So the next question was, okay, because again, harvest weed seed destruction, the effectiveness will depend on, again, Sarah mentioned it, it will rely on the ability of the weed to retain its seeds during harvest time. And so the question was, what is the percentage of retention of palmer seed at the time of harvest? And based on the research of the result, we found that this percentage was between 90% and 100% at the time of harvest. And these here on this graph, the x-axis is the percentage of retention, but on the y-axis, these are the counties where the samples were collected. And across all these counties, we found about 97% of seeds retained on the female plants at harvest, which is interesting, which means palmer can be a good target for this technique. We can use this technique to reduce the amount of viable seeds returning to a soil seed bank. So again, this is a combine. And again, there is nothing special about this combine except this piece of equipment which is attached to the back of the combine. And this is the impact mill. Basically here, this is the seed control unit in yellow here. And the seed control unit has 2 impact mills which are spinning in opposite directions, right? And so the wheat seeds, which is in the chaff during harvest, gets in the impact mill and gets heat devitalized before it returns to the soil seed bank. And so one of our questions was, okay, what is the potential of the seed destructor to render palmer seeds non-viable? So during harvest, some pens were placed at the back of the combine here on each side to collect the seeds which were exiting the seed control unit. And these seeds were observed under a microscope to see if there would be slightly cracked, moderately cracked, completely cracked. And so what we found was about 95% of the seeds were somehow destructed, which means they were non-viable, and only about 5% or so were still full seed. Again, which shows that this technique can be promising for us to be added to our tools. We are excited about having this technology here at the Ag Research Center in Hayes, and being able to use this in conjunction again with our strategies which are already existing, because it's not a standalone system. And we want to make sure that we integrate this into our effective herbicide programs and other strategies that are helpful. So we implemented a trial the past summer. We had a milo field which was full of pigweeds. And so we had some of the plots harvested with the seed control unit, and others were harvested without the seed control unit engaged. And these treatments will receive different herbicide programs, and we want to track the population dynamics of Palmer, the soil seed bank, the emergence pattern, and all these things, and how combining different herbicide strategies with this harvest weed seed control would help control Palmer, which is a big problem for our growers here in Kansas. And so again, it's all about combining all our strategies. We want to use effective herbicide modes of actions. We want to scout our fields. We want to use strategies like strategic tillage when needed, crop rotation. Of course, we want to include crop rotations in our practices, cover crops whenever possible, or even harvest weed seed control whenever possible. All these strategies can complement our herbicide programs. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions for Jeremie? Thanks, Jeremie, for explaining that. And I think all of you had a copy of his slides. So if you have any questions for him, after looking at this, he left his contact information for you, or you can get in touch with me and I can relay the question to Jeremie.
Thank you, Sandra.
Yes. And I think Sarah is up next.
All right, let's try this again.
Okay.
All right. Do you see what
And
you
you
should
all
see?
should have that. Yeah, and you all should have this handout as well to kind of look along and take notes. Okay. Thanks, Sarah.
All right. So we're going to kind of pick up a little bit where, Jeremie and I left off from the previous presentations. So, I showed some data on the timeliness of post-emergence applications. Jeremie spent a good amount of time talking about alternative approaches to weed control. And so this presentation is going to focus in on the importance of strong residual herbicide programs, which is, really nothing terribly new. We've really been talking about the role of residual herbicide programs in kind of trying to manage resistance to those post-emergence products. But I'll show you some data at the end of this slide set that may change a little bit the way we think about that. I just wanted to set the stage a bit here and let you guys know when I say residual herbicides, these are the types of products I'm talking about. So, really things like metribuzin or trichlor, dimetric, valor, any of our sulfentrazone or authority types of products, acetochlor products, okay, and those other group 15 products, Callisto. Okay, so those are the things when I say residual, those are what I'm thinking about, okay? And I had plugged this in case, kind of we had a bigger crowd, but I'm curious to know how many residual herbicides folks are using at planting, but I think to ask that question with a group this small might put some folks on the spot. So we'll skip right past it. This is a slide I put together a while back, just kind of to illustrate the fact that managing pigweeds is a season-long affair. I pulled mesonet data from Colby, soil temperature data, and what I want you to see is that we can germinate pigweeds from April to October in Northwest Kansas. Okay, so residual herbicides are important for maintaining weed control over that extended period of germination and emergence. But anybody who has applied very many residual herbicides knows that there are things that can prevent those herbicides from reaching their maximum effectiveness. So some things that prevent residual herbicide activity would be the herbicide not getting incorporated or not getting activated. So a lot of times when you read herbicide labels, you see language like you have to have an activating rainfall in order for the residual herbicide to work well. So in this case, that just means that the herbicide is staying on the surface of the soil and not moving down into the zone where those weed seeds are germinating. Other things that can happen is maybe that herbicide moved down into the soil profile, then everything dried out. And so that herbicide is no longer available for plant uptake. The herbicide can also just be absorbed to the surface of the soil, or it can be broken down by microorganisms. All of those things lead to reductions in the amount of herbicide that's in the soil solution. A question that I get with some amount of regularity is, well, what about photodegradation? The reason these residuals don't work is because they're sitting on the surface of the soil and they're breaking down in the sun. Photodegradation is real, it is a thing, but in general, the rate of photodegradation is low enough that it's not usually the factor that is going to be most limiting to herbicide effectiveness or the length of weed control we'll get from any one herbicide. So I included this slide set, not so much because it's good Kansas data, but because it's a good illustration of what can happen in terms of residual weed control over a variety of environments. So we've just got 2 years here. In this case, Rodrigo's group, they pulled just about every residual current corn herbicide they could get their hands on. And they looked at, in this case, water hemp control at one location. So this is one location, 4 replications in 2 different years. So take a look at that black vertical line that I put in each of those graphs. That is about 90% control for those years. And look at the 2021 data versus the 2022 data. In 2022, there's a lot more gradual spread in that data, and there are more data points to the left of that 90% control line. Sorry, my dog tried to join our Zoom this afternoon. Okay, so more to the left here. And then in 2021, there were mostly greater than 90% control with some very distinct products here down around 50% control. Now, the difference is, okay, the first week after application, these guys are in Wisconsin. They're up in God's country where it rains. So they got about the same amount, but here 2 weeks out, that inch of rain made a huge difference in what they saw in terms of weed control. This is a somewhat similar data set. These data can come from Arkansas, Missouri, Wisconsin. So they've got water hemp in Arkansas, in Wisconsin and Missouri, Palmer in Arkansas. And they were looking at some different herbicide programs for soybeans, either applied at planting, either applied at planting or 2 weeks before planting. Okay. And so I highlighted in purple a couple of programs where those error bars are such that the 14-day pre-plant application resulted in lower weed control compared to the at planting application. And so those 2 treatments, one was Tricor, which would be a metribuzin product, and the other was Boundary, which is metribuzin plus S-metolachlor, metribuzin plus dual. Okay. So those 2 products did not work well. In general, products that contained decidua tended to be among the highest weed control, regardless of the time of application. And then other products, there was just less difference between those 2 times. So I had a graduate student that tried to address the question of which group 15 herbicide should we use when. So group 15 herbicides would be things like S-metolachlor or dual acetochlor, so things like Warrant and Harness, or Inversa that we talked about earlier. Zidua, so the active ingredient there is pyroxasulfone, and then Outlook or dimethenamide. Okay. And so Tyler applied these herbicides at 4 or 5 different dates across 2 seasons. We started in mid-April and went through mid-May, trying to kind of look at some of the temperatures that would be appropriate, the conditions that would be appropriate for corn in that Northeast Kansas area. I know, some of you guys might be planting your corn a little later than that, but we were looking at how the environment affects these herbicides. So this graph here is kind of a overview of the findings. And so what I want you to see here is that top yellow line, that is the non-treated control, and we were measuring pigweed height. Okay, so that's the maximum amount of growth, the least amount of weed control we saw in those plots. Now, if you go to the other end of this, that teal line at the bottom is Zidua. Okay, so the least amount of total growth over the course of the study, and then followed by dual, Outlook, and acetochlor. So it's important to note this was Harness. So this was a not encapsulated acetochlor product. Would it have been interesting to have looked at an encapsulated acetochlor? Yes, but we thought that using a non-encapsulated formulation would be more comparing apples to apples for the purpose of this study. So one of the ways we looked at the data was to use these sort of like heat maps, kind of, where we looked at the x-axis, that's the amount of precipitation, okay? And on the y-axis, that's the amount of growing degree days that were accumulated. So the set of boxes on the left is a month after the treatments were sprayed. So regardless of the date, this is 4 weeks after the application. And then on the right is 8 weeks after every application. So what I want you to take away from the overview here is that at 4 weeks after application, there wasn't a ton of difference among the products. Zidua and Dual provided excellent weed control, defined as 95 to 100% weed control across all of the conditions that were evaluated. Acetochlor tailed off from a left to right. So as rainfall increased, we started to lose weed control. I'm sorry, that's acetochlor. And then Outlook or dimethenamide, you can see there's a couple of pockets. We could either have too much heat or too much rain. Both of those were associated with lower weed control. Now, this is where it gets interesting, though, I think, moving out to 8 weeks after treatment. This is what we want to see is good weed control for an extended period of time. So again, Zidua or that pyroxasulfone treatment, that had the highest weed control over the largest range of weather conditions or environmental conditions. Dual also had probably the next greatest excellent weed control area here. But then we get up here to acetochlor and Outlook, okay? And you can see that they're a little more water soluble compared to Zidua especially, but also to Dual. This is a similar analysis of a data set that comes out of the University of Illinois. I really put this up here because I wanted to show you that these same types of patterns hold true for other pigweed species in other places. So the bottom row here is water hemp. So that's probably of most interest to you guys. Giant foxtail is probably going to be different enough from green and yellow. I'm not sure how representative that would be for you guys. And then the other thing to point out about this slide, Chris is an excellent data scientist that has been working with the USDA. And what he did for his PhD dissertation is he looked at, you can see that range of years there. Um, 1992 to 2016, he looked at all of the data points from their herbicide evaluation program. And he tried to mine that data to tell the overarching story. So what is the big picture takeaway? Okay. I saw this data kind of early on at a scientific presentation. I thought, wow, that is so amazing. What a great tool to have and a great way to use that data. And then Chris actually expanded this project. And so now he's working with a data set that includes Kansas data as well as data from something like 15 other states. So we've had some papers come out of that working group or that data set. They've mostly been on glyphosate and glufosinate. So hopefully we'll get to some residual herbicide data out of that big data set soon. These are the takeaways from that initial data set with just the Illinois data. Not a big surprise here. The greatest probability of weed control occurred when there were 2 to 4 inches within 15 days of application. I know, that would be a dream, right? The lowest probability, not a surprise. The flip side of this is that the lowest probability of weed control occurred when there was no rain for 15 days after application. The thing that I thought was kind of interesting about the summaries that Chris developed out of this research is that temperature was only important when precipitation was limiting. So I think it just kind of proves what we know, that rainfall is the driving factor in our residual herbicide activity. Okay. Now, Chris divided these weed control treatments up into separating out single active ingredient treatments and then looking at some that were combinations. Okay, so here he's got on the left, you can see it's atrazine and acetochlor, atrazine and S-metolachlor, and then atrazine, metolachlor, and meso. Okay, so 3 different combinations there. The way you interpret the data on this graph, and so if you want to focus at the bottom panel there, that's water hemp, which is going to be the closest approximation that we would have for Palmer. If the error bars around those dots are to the right of that red dashed line, that means that weed control with that treatment was greater than weed control with the single active ingredient treatments in the study. Okay. So one of the benefits of mixing herbicides is that we increase the probability of successful weed control because we reduce the amount of rainfall that is necessary for activation or incorporation of those residual herbicides. So this is sort of another way of looking at that concept. These are the data points associated with those very first graphs that I showed you guys from the 2 kind of distinctly different weather years in Wisconsin. The thing to take away here, this looks like a snowman, right? So with one side of action, that big red oval represents the spread or the variability in those data points. So it went all the way from like 10% control up to 100% control over those 2 years. The single active ingredient treatments had statistically lower weed control than either 2 active ingredients or 3 effective active ingredients. But look at the size of that green oval compared to the blue oval. Even though those are not statistically different, guys, I'm a risk-averse human, and I would way rather have the risk or the potential for low weed control, excuse me, associated with the products that, or the treatments that had 3 effective herbicide modes of action compared to 2. There's much less variability in there across the 2 environments. So I was thinking about some of the data that I have collected. And these are data, again, primarily from Eastern Kansas. That's just kind of where my research is out of, right? Being based out of Manhattan. Which is why we're so glad we have guys like Jeremie. But this is some data points that my team gathered 8 to 12 weeks out after the last post-emergence application, and plots that either did or did not have a layered residual herbicide. So that second second residual herbicide application going out with our post-emergence herbicide application. So the product in most of these was dual magnum or S-metolachlor. So fairly consistent there. But what I want you to see, it's a similar message, similar takeaway to what we saw from the corn data out of Wisconsin. Okay, I could not separate statistically weed control or soybean yield in any of these locations. But being a risk-averse person, I would rather have the chances of low weed control that I see in the with layered residual herbicide group compared to the group of data points without layered residual herbicide. Okay. So just thinking about, kind of using some of these products, I wanted to summarize for you guys a couple of things here. One, our layered residual herbicides are mostly group 15s. There are some exceptions to that rule, atrazine and callisto in corn, for example. But by and large, group 15 herbicides. If you're going to do this, it's important to pay attention not only to the ability to get across the field if the crop is canopied or not, but also what are those application cutoffs for those herbicides. Now, this slide right here, I think is probably the most useful slide that I put together for these weed schools. And what I did here is I just took that big list of residual herbicides that I showed you guys at the beginning of this presentation, and I summarized some of the label language around the water that is necessary to get these products activated. So some of my favorite label excerpts include saying that we need adequate or sufficient amounts of precipitation or rainfall or an activating rainfall. That's not very helpful. Some of them do have, though, a very specific rainfall amounts listed there. So that can start to become more helpful. But what I want you to take away as you're thinking about building your residual herbicide programs is to combine herbicides with differing solubilities. So, for example, Callisto and dicamba have high water solubilities. That means it doesn't take a lot of rainfall to get that, or a lot of moisture to get that herbicide into solution, moving down to where those seeds are trying to germinate. So those are good. The downside of something with high water solubility is that it's more likely to be leached through the soil profile, right? So you'll get fast weed control, but maybe not long-lasting weed control. You need to have a herbicide then that has a little longer or a little lower solubility rather. So, things like flumioxazin or Zidua, right? We talked about Zidua having the greatest kind of duration of good control in that corn study I showed you earlier. Okay, that's partly because it has lower water solubility. It doesn't move out of the soil as fast as something like, say, Harness or another acetochlor product that tends to have higher water solubility. Okay, so thinking about which of these products do we want to use early in the season versus later in the season, certainly when we're in that layered residual setting, we want to choose a product that has a little higher water solubility if we can, because generally speaking, the chances of getting a rainfall at that later time tend to be a little less than what we think about chances of getting that a good activating rainfall earlier in the season. Okay, so just some things to think about there. So I
Sarah, can I ask you a
occasionally,
question? Sarah, can I ask you a question?
absolutely, Sandra. Yep, you bet.
You used SOA, which is the site of action, correct? And you've used that terminology. Has that changed or is that a new one instead of mode of action? You're using
Ah,
site action. Or does it mean the same?
it's for these purposes, it means the same thing.
Okay.
Technically speaking, like mode of action would be uh, a overall process, like an amino acid synthesis inhibitor. And then there are two target sites within that mode of action. So from a kind of academic exercise, site of action is probably more important compared to what we're talking about.
Okay.
Especially in light, there was a paper, honestly, I need to get my hands on it and like really read through it. But there's been a paper recently published that talks about the fact that really we're painting with too broad of a brush when we talk about herbicide resistance by mode of action, because we're seeing that there, especially with like up north trying to control summer annual grasses and spring wheat, with the group 1 herbicides, there's a lot of differences within that group, even just within the site of action group among different active ingredients. So just trying to think about easing us in to being more specific in terms of how we talk about herbicide resistance. But no, that's a really good question, Sandra. Thank you for clarifying that or making me clarify
Okay.
that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So another question that I occasionally get is, well, if it's hot and dry, can't I just increase my spray volume to, you fill in the blank with some somewhat outrageous level of spray volume, right? So I thought, well, let's take a look at this. I dug into the literature and there was some research out of Australia where they found that when they increased the spray volume, it was effective at reducing the amount of ryegrass emergence. Okay. So we wanted to see if that translated to pigweed control in corn in Kansas. Long story short, the answer is no. Okay. We saw a couple of specific instances where there were some differences in spray volume, but at most of our sites, it didn't matter if we had these spray volumes come out to be something like 6, 13, and 20, I think, for the spray volumes there. There were no differences in those spray volumes. So we've talked a lot about residual herbicides. We've talked a lot about the fact that we're using a lot of group 15 herbicides. So dual, harness, warrant, outlook, zidua. There is reason to be very concerned about the development of resistance to group 15 herbicides. Okay. This is data from a field experiment in Arkansas where they went on to confirm resistance to this population of Palmer amaranth to dual, to S-metolachlor. The good thing is that harness and outlook were still resulting in the expected levels of control. Okay. Another aspect of this population that is important to look at here is that it is metabolic resistance to dual in this case. Okay, so I talked about the fact that metabolic resistance is harder to see because it's a more gradual development. It takes a long time and there's just incremental reductions in weed control. But also it's hard to tell that weeds didn't germinate or didn't emerge relative to weeds that didn't die, right? So it's just a little more tricky to find resistance to residual herbicides, but I do hope you guys will work with us to be on the lookout for residual herbicide failures that cannot be attributed to weather, because we would like to identify these populations in Kansas sooner than later. Okay. I mean, we do, Jeremie and I both collect pigweed samples in the fall from fields and screen them for resistance. But if you've got a population that's of concern, we need to collect from that field in addition to our random samples. Okay. This is, again, water hemp data from Illinois. Just wanted to show you guys some of the variability in these populations in terms of group 15 herbicide resistance. So this is another field experiment. They looked at an encapsulated acetochlor product. That's the first one. They looked at a non-encapsulated acetochlor product. They looked at S-metolachlor with a safener, metolachlor, outlook, alachlor, and then Zidua. Okay. So the takeaway here is that they did confirm metabolic resistance to S-metolachlor in this population. And once again, they think it was metabolic herbicide resistance. So, takeaways from this slide set. We're looking for at least 2 effective residual herbicides that have differing levels of water solubility. 3 effective active ingredients would be better in terms of reducing the risk of herbicide failure. And then just please be on the lookout for resistance to group 15 herbicides. That'd be your duals, your harness and warrant types of products, your Zidua and Outlook. So with that, I'll let Jeremie take the wheel again. I will stop sharing. All right. So
Okay.
it looks like, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question. Yeah, there is a question there, and I think you can see it now.
What is the relationship between, I love it when Luke asks me an econ question and I'm like,
I know.
I don't know, I just spray weeds. What is the relationship between marginal cost of the additional mode of action compared to marginal control of yield? Not to mention the cost benefit of delaying resistance. Luke, if you've got somebody who is economist enough to help me work on those questions, actually, I think we might have somebody who's interested. We need to get a student on it, a mutual student on it. But I think those questions are very important and very answerable, at least from a modeling perspective. And I think we need to get that information out there. And so, yeah, it's a great question. And it's just not one that I have been able to really sink my teeth into yet. So.
Hey, any other questions for Sarah? And that was her last presentation. So we're on our last presentation here. Remind you, I'm going to put up in the chat the link to the evaluation and a QR code as well. So I appreciate it if at the end of the presentations, if you would take a little time, maybe a couple minutes to go in and fill out that survey information. So I'm going to go on and turn it over to Jeremie. And you should have a copy of this presentation as well.
All right, thank you, Sandra. Can you see my slides? Can you see the slides, Sandra?
Yes. Yeah, we can see him,
Perfect.
Jeremie.
Sounds great. All right, thank you again for these other presentations, for which I will be focusing on some herbicide programs in grain sorghum and, of course, some on corn. And I like to start this presentation with herbicide resistance, a chart which is here. Sarah already talked a lot about herbicide resistance, which means it's of a big concern, and we have to keep this in mind when we start talking about selecting some herbicide programs for weed control. We need to understand which weeds are the most problematic and which herbicides are the ones that to which weeds tend to evolve resistance to so easily. So here this chart is showing on the x-axis the number of species that have evolved resistant to some herbicides on the y-axis here. And this is globally. And what we can see here, the first bar on the top here, it's atrazine. And what this is telling us is about 62 species globally have evolved resistance to atrazine. And atrazine is a key molecule when it comes to weed control in grain sorghum and in corn. The other one is glyphosate. We know how important glyphosate is for our corn production, our soybean production, even in our fallows. So we see about 60 species have evolved resistance to glyphosate globally. Next, we have some herbicides here. All these herbicides have something in common. We call all these the group 2 herbicides or ALS inhibiting herbicides. They all target the same enzyme, and we see that there are so many species globally that have evolved resistance to those group 2 herbicides. The next graph is about the number of site of actions. Again, site of actions, Sarah explained it a few minutes ago, and I will be using those interchangeably, site of action or modes of action in order to help us understand what we are talking about. And so on the y-axis here, we see some species. So these are like the top 15 herbicides, which have the most cases of resistance to different site of actions. And among these species, we can see Palmer here, Palmer pigweed, which is like the top broadleaf species. I was curious, I wanted to map the distribution of Palmer resistance across the country. And I saw like number of modes of actions to which it was resistant would be between 1 and 6. In Arkansas, we can have more than 6 because some cases of resistance to group 15 herbicides, as metolachlor, on which I worked for my PhD, and glufosinate as well. So in Arkansas, we will have more than 8, or I would say more than 6 modes of actions to which herbicide, Palmer is resistant. But focusing on Kansas, we see that we have up to 6 modes of action to which Palmer has evolved resistance. And a population that K-State researchers collected from a long-term conservation tillage field was reported to have evolved resistance to 6 modes of action or site of action, depending on how we want to call it. So, and this population could not be controlled by herbicides such as Glean, Harmony. This one would be, I think this is Pursuit or New Path, and the other one is Beyond. So basically, this herbicide was cross-resistant to the IMIs and the sulfonyl ureas. It was also resistant to 2,4-D, atrazine, metribuzin, glyphosate, Cobra and Flexstar, as well as Callisto and Lodis. And the reason why this population was resistant to so many herbicides, again, it's because of a type of herbicides resistance which was detected in the population, which is the metabolic resistance that Sarah already talked about, and which is due to large enzyme families known as GSTs or cytochrome P450s that have this ability to break down the molecule into non-toxic molecules. So why this is a concern is because those enzymes will be able to detoxify or to metabolize or even to break down, is the same thing, herbicide from different modes of actions, right? So that's why it's such a big concern. These researchers reported also that this population, which was resistant to those herbicides under higher temperature regimes, was 23 times more resistant to 2,4-D. But under cooler conditions, it was just 2-fold or 2 times more resistant, suggesting that under cooler conditions, control could be improved. So again, something I'm gonna talk about again, Sarah already mentioned it, but when we start talking about herbicide resistance management or metabolic resistance management, we want to diversify our approaches. And from a chemical control standpoint, herbicide of multiple modes of action can help, even though they are not guaranteed. I mean, we need to complement those. And in the previous presentation, we talked about this with different strategies. But one of the best management strategies that weed scientists recommend is to use herbicides of multiple modes of action or that target multiple site of actions. So again, there are many ways we can choose those herbicides that target different site of actions. And one of those methods I generally recommend is the use of this herbicide classification chart, which is really helpful. So what it does, basically, it provides the list of herbicides which target a single site of action. We have the chemical families. At the same time, we also have some premixes which are on the market. And those premixes, we have all the active ingredients which make this premix and the different site of actions which are targeted by those active ingredients. So familiarizing ourselves with this chart can help us choose herbicides, rotate our herbicide modes of actions from one year to the next, or choosing different active ingredients with different modes of action when it comes to making our tank mixes, or selecting our premixes, or even making our sequential applications throughout the growing season. And this chart can be downloaded from just typing this in Google. It's going to take us to a link where we can get access to a PDF form. Most of the time when we have these presentations in person, we try to bring some of those charts which are available and distribute them. But you can get access to this. But again, if you want some hard copies of these, feel free to shoot us an email. We can get some sent to your county extension offices so you can grab those. Here, I want to talk a little bit about residual herbicide programs for grain sorghum. Basically, we have about 7 primarily used active ingredients. And these are the group 5 herbicide atrazine. We also have the group 15 herbicides, which are fatty acid inhibitors. We have S-metolachlor and metolachlor. We have acetochlor, dimethylamine P. Then we have the group 27 mesotrione or Callisto, group 14 sulfurfenacil, and there is possibility to use the group 2 herbicide imazamox, but just when we use the high growth sorghum. And I want to highlight a couple of things when it comes to using our group 15 herbicides in grain sorghum. The first thing is to be used, we want to make sure that the sorghum is concept treated, which means the seeds have been treated with a safener. And what the safener does, it's going to just prevent injury to the crop. The other thing I want to point out is about the formulations of metolachlor we have on the market. We have some products like Parallel. And as we can see here, the active ingredients for Parallel is metolachlor. Another one is metolachlor, and the active ingredients is also metolachlor. But then when we switch to other products like Dual 2 Magnum, when we see the active ingredients here, it's S-metolachlor, which is similar to zinc. The active ingredient is S-metolachlor. And the difference between those formulations is the metolachlor molecule has what we call in general 2 isomers, 2 pairs of isomers. And on one hand, we have what we call the R isomers, and on the other hand, we have what we call the S isomers. And the herbicidal effect of metolachlor comes from the S isomers. And in the formulations like metolachlor, where we have just metolachlor as the active ingredients, we have equal proportion of those two pairs of isomers. We have 50% R isomers and 50% of S isomers. In contrast, when we talk about those products where we have S-metolachlor, we have more than 80% of the most effective pairs of isomers, which is S isomers. So these products with S-metolachlor as active ingredients will be more effective when applied at the same rate than the metolachlor formulation. So these are things to keep in mind when it comes to choosing your metolachlor product. Some will be more effective for weed control compared to others. And again, we are talking about using herbicides with multiple modes of actions, herbicides with active ingredients that target different side of actions. So here we have on the market two-way mix options as well as three-way mix options. So talking about the two-way mix options, we have group 5 and group 15 herbicides. We have, for example, Bicep 2 Magnum and Bicep Light 2 Magnum. The two of them have exactly the same active ingredients with some differences when it comes to the concentrations of those active ingredients. Degree Extra and Full-Time NXT are also mixes of group 5 and group 15 with the difference of having acetochlor instead of S-metolachlor. Group 14 and group 15, we have Verdict. And group 15 and group 27, we have Zimax and Coyote, which have the same concentrations of S-metolachlor and mesotrione. Calibra has the same active ingredients, but at lower concentrations. Now, the three-way mix options, we have a combination of group 5, group 15, and group 27. We have Lumax Easy and Lexar Easy. Both have the same active ingredients, but at different concentrations. One of the good things here with this premix is the presence of atrazine and mesotrione. Research showed that mixing atrazine and mesotrione has what we call synergistic interactions. So what this does is it increases control because atrazine was reported to increase the uptake of mesotrione. So having these two herbicides together, it's gonna give some improvement to the control. And having the group 15 herbicide in these premixes is a plus. This is an experiment, a field trial that we conducted the past summer, looking at the impact of a single application and overlapping residual herbicide programs for palmer pigweed control. So we had these herbicide programs listed here, and two of them were received Lumax Easy applied Preemergence, followed by Degree Extra, either Degree Extra or Outlook plus Atrix. And the second application occurred about 21 days after the first one. The first application occurred the day of planting grain sorghum. And the results we got were those two herbicide programs here were the ones that provided the lowest control, which was about 90% and lower than 90%. But all the other herbicide programs provided an excellent control, which was about 99 to 100% control. We will say, we can say that, okay, 90% control is good enough, right? With just using those two herbicide programs. But it's again, this comes back to what Sarah talked about, preaching the zero tolerance, right? Or zero seed production. And again, palmer is a high seed producer. So even leaving some escapes in the field, those will produce a lot of seeds. And these seeds if they return to a soil seed bank, it's going to be another problem the next season. So being able to achieve an excellent control should be a target. I want to talk a little bit about some of the technologies we have on the market that can help us use different herbicide programs. We have high growth grain sorghum, for which we have hybrids which are resistant to imazamox. And imazamox is a herbicide which is commonly used beyond. And the herbicide labeled for high growth is the Imiflex from UPL. It's going to provide some grass control, large crabgrass, foxtails, as well as some broadleaf control, kochia, common long squatters, and other species. It can be used as a pre or as a post. The next one is also a group 2, offers the possibility to use another group 2 herbicide. So this is the Enzen technology. And hybrids are resistant to herbicide nicosulfuron or accent. The labeled product for this, though, is Zest from Corteva, and it's going to provide, some grass control, large crabgrass, foxtails, and sandburs, all these. And it will be applied mostly as a post. But again, the caveats with those technologies is we have to keep in mind, that's something we already know and we already talked about, is like our group 2 herbicides are the ones to which weeds evolved resistance to so easily. We have more cases of resistance to group 2 herbicides than to any other herbicide modes of action. And all these species listed here are weeds that have evolved resistant to some group 2 herbicides. So we want to keep in mind that using those technologies, we don't want to rely so heavily in group 2 herbicides, because doing so will lead to herbicide resistance evolution so rapidly. The last technology when it comes to grain sorghum is the double team. And I think this is the one that most growers use, because this offers us the possibility to use a group 1 herbicide, a FOP herbicide, right, which is quizalofop. So the hybrids here are resistant to quizalofop, which is the same herbicide as in Assure 2. And the labeled herbicide for this technology is First Act from Adama. Even though we have less cases of resistance to group 1, but it's still a concern. And to be able to preserve this technology and other technologies for the longest duration, we want to make sure that we are using good stewardship practices. We want to make sure that we control Johnson grass and sugarcane. Those 2 species are weedy relatives of grain sorghum, and as such, they can exchange pollen with grain sorghum. And if we allow this exchange of pollen, it means the resistance trait, which is in the grain sorghum, will be transferred to those weeds, and we'll have bigger challenges controlling those. And in order to prevent this, we want to make sure that before those 2 species reach the flowering stage, we want to get them under control. It's also important to control volunteer sorghum in the following year before it starts flowering. And all the best practices that we already know, right? Sarah talked about how we want to use sanitation and prevention, right? And this is important. We want to start in weed-free fields. We want to keep those fields as weed-free as possible for the growing season. We want to make sure that our borders, our road ditches, the fences, all these areas are free of those problematic weeds. Let's talk about Johnson grass, sugarcane. We want them to be as free as possible to avoid, green pollen exchange. And we want to clean our equipment again. All these strategies can help us preserve those technologies for the longest duration. Here, I'm going to talk a little bit about enlist corn and some of the herbicide programs that can help us achieve good control. Enlist corn allows us to use multiple herbicide programs for control. We have the possibility to use a group 1 herbicide. Again, the same as in double team, but here it has another name, right? We will be using the Assure 2, and it's going to provide us some level of control of several grasses, right? Foxtail, volunteer corn, fall panicum, barnyard grass, wherever we can find those. And we have the option of using enlist 1, which is going to target our broadleaves, right? Enlist 1, which is 2,4-D choline. But again, we also have the possibility to use enlist 2, which is a combination of 2,4-D choline and glyphosate, which is going to, increase the spectrum of weeds that can be controlled. Even though we know there are so many weeds which have evolved resistant to glyphosate, but it's still providing some level of control, right? So having this tank mix can help achieve some level of suppression of some of the weeds there. And the other one is, of course, glufosinate. Sarah already talked a lot about glufosinate. And this is another option we can use in this corn. And being able to make some mixtures between glufosinate and atrazine can improve the control of some of the pigweeds, morning glories, lamb squatters. And the presence of atrazine is going to provide some residual control, which is interesting. This is a research trial conducted last summer at our Garden City location, and Pat Geyer shared this data, which was really nice. And so I want to talk briefly about this trial and the main findings. So basically, this trial was looking at different herbicide programs and how they would impact weed control. And the weeds targeted here are Palmer pigweeds, kochia, and foxtails. So in this list of herbicide programs, we can see the top 2 herbicide programs did not have any pre-emergence herbicide program. We had Zelo, the new product Sarah talked about, which is a combination of quizalofop and glufosinate applied when the weeds were 2 to 3 inch tall, and another shot occurred about 20 days later. The second program was the same herbicide Zelo, but in tank mix with Dual 2. And all the rest of the programs are a combination of a pre-emergence herbicide application followed by another herbicide program. And so here we see this is Dual 2 Magnum, which is only one mode of action or one active ingredient. We have here the number 6, which is just Atrix, which also has a single active ingredient. But all the other herbicides, which are new herbicides, Certain, Resicor, and Storen, have at least 2 active ingredients which target at least 2 site of actions. And these programs, again, were followed by post-emergence herbicide programs, most of which were applied when the weeds were 5 inch tall. So the findings could be summarized with this graph. Here we can take a look at those 2 herbicide programs on the top here. We see the Zelo followed by Zelo, and the Zelo plus Dual, those 2 herbicide programs which did not include any pre-emergence herbicide program. And these results were obtained 73 days after application. On the x-axis here, we see the percentage of control. And the weed species, we see the darkest purple is pigweed. The middle color is kochia, and the lightest color is foxtail. What we can learn from this is those two first herbicide programs here did not give a consistent good control of the species. The other point is they achieved the lowest control of kochia. Using all the herbicide programs, kochia was the one they had the lowest control of, regardless of the herbicide program used. The other point, though, is when we consider the pre-emergence herbicide program that had only atrazine, we saw a low control, right? But all the other herbicide programs which had a pre followed by a post provided an excellent control of both pigweeds and foxtail species, which again emphasizes the importance of having our pre-emergence herbicide programs out there. These are critical because, you know, that's common knowledge, right? But it's always good to talk about it again and again, because the weeds which emerge the earliest in the field will be the most competitive with our crops. They will be the ones that are going to use more soil moisture. They will use more nutrients from the soil. And as they grow fast and can overtop our crops, they will be the ones that will intercept more light, right, from the sun. And as a result, they will induce more yield reduction. They will produce more seeds, what we don't want. And so having our residual herbicide programs upfront is gonna help us achieve a good control. And again, it's about having a strong residual herbicide programs upfront. And then when we have some escapes, we can come with another shot, a second pass with a good post-emergence herbicide program. And talking about post-herbicide programs, timeliness is critical, because the sooner our post-emergence herbicide programs are put out there, the higher the chance for us to achieve a better control. This research was conducted in Arkansas, and so we had 5 herbicide programs, dicamba alone, 2,4-D alone, glufosinate alone, and glufosinate plus 2,4-D and glufosinate plus dicamba. And we had about 6 sizes of pigweed to which those herbicide programs were applied. And this experiment was done again in 2020 in no crop conditions at 2 different locations. And this image, which is an aerial view captured using a drone, tells the story, right? So let's just focus on this replication, which is at the bottom, which is the first replication. And so what those yellow bars are, they separate like the groups of herbicide programs applied to specific sizes of the pigweed. So we see here, when the herbicides were applied to 2-inch tall palmer plants, we can clearly see here we had a better control. Some of the weeds or some of the plots are weed-free. But as the size of the weed increased, we see we have less and less control. And the last plot here is the non-treated control. And we can see this non-treated control is kind of similar to some of those plots when the herbicides were applied at a later time. It makes sense, right? But it's always good to repeat these things, because it's really critical for us to achieve a good control when we apply those herbicides very early enough. So when we did some weed counts at the end of the experiment, we saw that delaying the herbicide application from 2-inch tall to 6-inch tall and others, there was an increase on average on the number of weeds, right? Increasing to 5, 7, 9, 11, 13 weeds per square foot as the plant of the weed was increasing. So again, it's important to keep in mind that overlapping herbicide or residual herbicides with multiple modes of actions, group 5, group 15, and group 27, will improve weed control in green sorghum. And in the endless corn, using a good pre-emergence herbicide program followed by a post-herbicide program, it's gonna also improve control of grasses like foxtails and pigweed, which is one of our biggest concerns. Another point is applying our post-emergence herbicides to small size pigweeds, which are less than 2-inch tall or equal to 2-inch tall. It's going to provide an excellent control, but delaying to 6-inch tall or larger sizes of palmer, it's going to provoke control failure. So it's all again about having a good herbicide or a good control program in mind and be timely. Being proactive, it's going to help us achieve good control. And with that, I will take any questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jeremie and Sarah. We'll stay on here just for a couple minutes in case you have any questions. I put there in the chat the link for the evaluation or the QR code. So whichever you prefer. I also might email it out just to remind you guys that we really appreciate your input, especially in the evaluations, because it really helps us customize and tailor all the programs, educational programs that we do for you.